The wind swept across the vast plains, relentless and cold, carrying with it the scent of dust and the promise of nothing. The land stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of brown and gray. The sky, heavy with thick clouds, seemed to press down on the earth, suffocating the life out of anything that dared to grow. The only sound that filled the air was the howling of the wind as it scraped against the weathered walls of the cabin, making the old wood groan and creak under its force. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burning wood, the only comfort in the otherwise empty room. A fire crackled in the hearth, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. The heat from the flames was a poor match for the chill that clung to the bones, a cold that seeped in through the cracks in the cabin and settled into the heart. The rancher sat in a chair near the fire, his face half hidden in the shadows, his eyes staring into the flames as if searching for something he had long since stopped believing in. His hands were rough and calloused, worn by years of working the land. His clothes were faded, once rich in color but now dulled by time and the harshness of the life he had chosen. The cowboy hat on the chair beside him was just as worn, the edges frayed and battered by the winds that seemed to always be in motion. His once strong frame had become bent, shoulders slumped by the weight of years filled with loss and solitude. His eyes, sharp and intense once, were now clouded, distant, haunted by ghosts of the past. This was a man who had learned early that life had a way of taking more than it gave. He had loved and lost. A wife, a son, and friends, all taken from him by time, fate, and the unforgiving land. The grief had come slowly at first, gnawing at his heart until there was nothing left to feel but the emptiness. Now all that was left was the cabin, the land, and the long, cold nights that stretched out like endless roads. Out here in the desolate silence, he had learned to close himself off. There was no one left to care for, no one left to love. The land had taught him that survival was all that mattered, and survival meant keeping everything at arm's length. He had become a man who had buried his heart deep in the earth along with the graves of his loved ones. But even the hardest of men have moments when the walls begin to crack, when the past rises up in the form of a memory or a sound, and the silence becomes too heavy to bear. It was during one of these rare moments, when the rancher sat staring into the fire, that he heard the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, like the wind itself had decided to pause for a moment and knock on his door. The sound cut through the stillness of the cabin, sharp and unexpected. He froze, his hand hovering over his whiskey bottle. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long. His boots scraped across the wooden floor as he moved toward the door, his face unreadable, his mind a whirl of thoughts he had long since buried. He paused just before the door, his hand on the handle. For a moment he considered turning away, retreating into the safety of his solitude. But something, perhaps the wind, perhaps the pull of a memory, urged him to open the door. When he did, the cold air rushed in, followed by a figure, a woman and a child, both shivering from the cold. The woman's face was drawn with exhaustion, her eyes hollow and desperate. The child clung to her, wide-eyed, lost in the world of this stranger's cabin. They looked like they had come from far, far away, and the storm had caught up with them. The rancher's hand tightened on the doorframe as he studied them. His heart, though buried deep, skipped a beat. And for the first time in many years, something stirred in him, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. The woman's breath came in quick, shallow gasps, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She clutched the child's hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. The rancher stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do, his eyes scanning them both. The little girl, no older than 7 or 8, was shivering, her face pale from the cold and exhaustion. Her wide, innocent eyes met his for a brief second before she looked down, clutching her mother's skirt like a lifeline. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. We've been traveling for days, the storm. It caught us, we need shelter, just for the night." The rancher didn't move at first, his gaze lingering on the child. The past years had taught him to trust no one, to rely only on himself. There was no room in his world for the weak, for those who couldn't survive on their own. He had turned away countless travelers in the past, drifters, lost souls looking for a way out of the wilderness. But something about this woman's plea, the desperation in her voice, made him hesitate. "Ma'am," he finally spoke, his voice rough, like the wind had stripped away any softness he once had. "There's no place for you here. The storm's bad, and there's nothing but cold and hunger for miles." The woman's eyes seemed to darken at his words, but her resolve only hardened. "I'm not asking for much, just a place to rest. My daughter, she's sick. She's too young to be out here in this cold." Her voice broke slightly as she glanced down at the child, whose fragile frame seemed to tremble more with each passing second. The rancher shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. There were risks in taking them in, disease, trouble, perhaps even a lie. He had seen too much of that in his life, too many false faces hiding the truth. He could just close the door, turn away, and they would be nothing but another shadow in his memory. But something inside him, a voice he hadn't heard in years, urged him to do the opposite. The wind howled louder as if pleading with him, but still he stood there. His thoughts swirled, but then his eyes met the child's again. There was something in her gaze that he couldn't ignore, an innocence that hadn't yet been touched by the cruelty of the world, something so fragile, so untouched by loss. The look in her eyes was as if she had already resigned herself to whatever fate would give her, and yet there was still a flicker of hope, of trust. "Fine," the rancher said, his voice low, filled with reluctant acceptance. He opened the door wider, stepping back to let them in. "But only for the night, and if you're looking for charity, you'll find none here." The woman's relief was palpable. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. She stepped inside, followed by the child, and the warmth of the cabin filled the space where the cold had been. The rancher closed the door behind them, his eyes lingering on the two as they settled by the fire. The child immediately huddled close to the flames, her tiny hands outstretched, as if hoping the fire would melt away the bitter cold that had seeped into her bones. The woman, weary and drawn, sat beside her, wrapping her arms around the girl protectively. The rancher watched them for a moment, his face expressionless, but his mind still swirling with thoughts he couldn't chase away. "Where are you from?" he asked, trying to fill the silence with something, anything. It was a question that he hadn't meant to ask, but it slipped out, the curiosity finding its way through his hardened exterior. "We were from a small homestead just outside of Willow Creek," the woman replied quietly. "But it was destroyed, a fire, and then the cattle came down sick. We tried to move south, but—" She trailed off, not finishing the sentence, as if the memory itself was too painful to speak. The rancher said nothing for a long time. He had heard enough of those kinds of stories, small towns, small lives, all of them snuffed out by one disaster or another. He had no patience for tales of hardship anymore. They were all the same. But this woman's eyes, eyes that carried the weight of a journey far more brutal than most, compelled him to listen. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she held the child close, or maybe it was the quiet grief that hung around her like a cloud. Whatever it was, the rancher found himself sitting down across from them, his boots dragging against the wooden floor, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Your name?" the rancher asked again, his tone softer now, less hostile than before. "Emma," she replied, looking up at him with weary eyes. "And this is Rose." The name hung in the air like the softest of winds, Rose. The rancher looked at the child again, her small face illuminated by the firelight, her eyes still wide and uncertain. She glanced up at her mother, who smiled faintly and brushed a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead. The rancher shifted, uncomfortable in the silence. He wasn't used to this, being around people, letting them in even for a moment. His world had been too small for too long, just him and the land. He didn't know how to play the role of savior, and he certainly didn't know how to comfort. But as the night wore on, he found himself tending to them, pouring what little food he had into a pot, stoking the fire to keep them warm. And as the hours passed, the tension in the room began to ease, if only slightly. The flicker of the flames reflected off the walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance with life. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible moment, the rancher found himself asking a question he hadn't expected. What if they weren't just passing through? What if this woman and child, in some strange twist of fate, had come to fill a gap he hadn't realized existed inside him? He looked at them again. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. The storm outside raged on, howling and thrashing against the walls of the cabin, as though it too was searching for something. Inside, the warmth of the fire was the only thing that kept the chill at bay, and yet it couldn't ease the weight that had settled deep in the rancher's chest. He sat there in the flickering light, watching Emma and Rose, unable to shake the unease that had begun to gnaw at him since they had arrived. The child, Rose, had fallen into a restless sleep, curled up on the worn rug near the hearth, her small body still and fragile. Emma, on the other hand, was awake, her eyes fixed on the fire, though her thoughts seemed far away, drifting somewhere beyond the room, beyond the storm. The silence between them was thick, heavy with things unspoken, yet both of them seemed to be aware that something was shifting in the air. The rancher could feel it, the tension, the unsaid words, the space between them that neither seemed willing to cross. The woman's voice broke the stillness like a sudden gust of wind, soft but firm. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her eyes not meeting his. "We'll leave once the storm clears. We just need a little time. A little rest." The rancher's gaze remained on her, his face unreadable, though inside something stirred, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He had seen this kind of pain before, had seen it in his own reflection, had seen it in the faces of men who had lost everything. But he had never allowed himself to offer any comfort. He had learned long ago that there was no place for softness in a world that was unforgiving. Yet here he was with this woman and child, offering them his warmth, his fire, his shelter, with no real reason except that something inside him had cracked open, just enough to let them in. He stood abruptly, his boots scraping against the wooden floor as he moved toward the window, looking out at the storm. His reflection in the glass was barely visible, distorted by the wind and the cold that blurred the panes. "You don't need to leave," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "The storm's not letting up. It's too dangerous. Stay the night." Emma didn't respond immediately, and he didn't turn around. There was something about her silence that was harder to bear than any words she could have spoken. The rancher could feel her eyes on him now, studying him with a quiet intensity that unsettled him. "You don't have to pretend," Emma said after a long pause, her voice soft but carrying an edge that made him turn back toward her. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not doing this because you want to. You're doing it because you feel like you have to." The words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment he felt the familiar sting of guilt, the same guilt that had haunted him for years. He looked at Emma, the flickering firelight casting shadows on her face, and saw the vulnerability there, the raw truth of her situation. Her daughter, her only family, was asleep, her tiny body trembling, but it was more than just the cold. It was the weight of the journey, the weight of loss and grief that Emma carried with her, the burden of a past she couldn't shake. "I'm not pretending," the rancher said quietly, his voice hoarse. I don't know how to do this anymore." He moved away from the window and sat back down across from her, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've lived alone for so long, I forgot what it was like to have someone, to have people around. I didn't expect." He stopped, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He had never been good with emotions, never been good at talking about feelings. But Emma's gaze was steady, patient, as though waiting for him to figure out what he needed to say. The silence that followed was heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, but it was in that quiet that something shifted. The rancher had long ago shut himself off from the world, from any kind of connection, from the possibility of opening up to someone again. The pain of losing his family had been too much, and he had built walls around himself so thick that nothing could get through. But now, with Emma and Rose in his cabin, with their warmth and their vulnerability, something inside him was starting to break. The walls that had once kept him safe were now suffocating him, and he was realizing, for the first time in years, that maybe it wasn't safety he needed. Maybe it was something else. "I lost my family," he said finally, his voice thick with the weight of the admission. "A long time ago, my wife, my son, I couldn't save them, and I haven't been able to forgive myself for it." His words were quiet, barely a whisper, but in them he revealed the raw, unhealed wound that had been buried deep within him for so long. Emma looked at him, her expression softening, the hardness in her eyes melting away as she reached for her daughter's hand. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. She simply nodded as if she understood, as if the hurt that he had carried for so long was something they both shared. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I understand more than you know." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment the rancher felt a flicker of something deep inside him, something that felt like healing, something that felt like the first step toward forgiveness. It wasn't the easy kind of forgiveness, the kind that could fix everything at once. No, it was the kind of forgiveness that took time, that grew slowly, like the fire that burned in the hearth. But it was there in that moment, and it was real. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire seemed to grow. The space between them had shifted. The walls that had once separated them now felt a little thinner, and in that quiet, unspoken understanding, the rancher realized something he had long forgotten. He was not alone anymore. He had never truly been alone. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind howling like a wild animal, but within the cabin, a strange peace had begun to settle. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warm glow casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. The rancher sat by the fire, his back straight but his mind far from the sharp, defensive edge it had held just hours before. Now he felt a quiet stillness within himself, a momentary calm that had been absent for too long. Emma had fallen asleep beside her daughter, her face softened in the warmth of the fire, her body still and peaceful for the first time in what seemed like forever. Rose, wrapped in a heavy quilt, was curled up in her mother's arms, her small hand tucked into Emma's sleeve. The sight of them, so fragile yet so trusting, stirred something deep within the rancher, something that hadn't stirred in years. He couldn't deny it anymore. He had made a decision, a choice he hadn't expected to make, but it had come so naturally. He had offered them shelter not out of obligation, but because something inside him had told him to. And now, as he watched them sleep, the weight of that decision seemed to settle on his shoulders, but not as a burden. It was something else, something lighter, something more hopeful. The rancher leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. He had expected to feel regret, to feel the sting of vulnerability that had kept him isolated for so long. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the storm's fury outside, he only felt a strange sense of peace. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had let them in, let them share his fire, his home. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone in this space. It wasn't the kind of company he had ever thought he wanted, but it was the kind he needed. The rancher stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting for too long, and walked over to the small table by the window. He glanced outside, his eyes narrowing as he watched the storm continue to rage. The world outside seemed so distant, so separate from the warmth that had begun to fill his home. But even in the isolation of his cabin, he couldn't escape the feeling that the storm outside mirrored something deeper within him. A struggle he had been carrying for so long, and one that had finally started to calm. Emma's voice, soft but clear, broke the stillness. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her words muffled by sleep but still carrying the weight of gratitude and something more. The rancher didn't turn around at first. "I did," he replied quietly, his voice rougher than he had intended. "I don't know why, but I did." He could hear her shift in her blankets, the rustle of the fabric as she adjusted herself. "We've been on the road for days," she continued, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I don't know what we would have done without you." He turned then, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the cabin. Emma was sitting up now, her hands wrapped around the quilt that covered Rose. Her eyes were tired, but there was something different about the way she looked at him now, something softer, something that spoke of shared understanding. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice almost gruff. "You're here now, that's all that matters." The words felt strange, and yet they held a truth he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. He didn't expect gratitude, not from Emma or anyone else. It wasn't in his nature. But there was something about this moment that made the words feel more than just a formality. They were the truth of it. The truth of what he had done, what he was beginning to understand. Emma nodded slowly as though absorbing what he had said. "I know," she replied, "but you didn't have to open your door to us. You didn't have to offer us your shelter." The rancher turned his gaze back to the fire, the dancing flames casting shadows on his face. He didn't know what to say. He didn't have the words. What he had done wasn't something he could explain. It wasn't something that needed explaining. It was just a decision he had made, and now here they were. A small sound, soft and unbidden, caught his attention. Rose stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching for her mother's, and the rancher felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he had seen such a simple, peaceful moment. He hadn't realized how much he had missed it, how much he had been yearning for it without even knowing. The quiet of the room deepened, and the rancher remained by the fire, his thoughts slow and uncertain, but for once not filled with regret. He had made a choice, and he was beginning to understand that it wasn't just about offering shelter for a night. It was about more than that. It was about offering something he had almost forgotten existed: connection. When Emma spoke again, her voice softer now, it felt like the conclusion to an unspoken understanding. "We'll stay as long as we're welcome," she said, her eyes meeting his once more, an unspoken promise in her gaze. The rancher met her gaze, his own eyes steady. "As long as you need," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. There was a moment of quiet, and for a fleeting second, the rancher allowed himself to believe that this wasn't just the storm passing. It was the beginning of something new, something unexpected, something he hadn't known he was capable of. And in that quiet, still moment, as he watched the family he hadn't expected to take in, the rancher finally understood. In offering them shelter, he had given himself something far greater, something that would keep him warm long after the storm had passed. It wasn't just warmth in the fire, It was warmth in his heart, something that had been cold for far too long. The storm might still be raging outside, but in the heart of the cabin, the air felt still, quiet. And for the first time in many years, the rancher could breathe. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, the silence had changed. The fierce winds and the howling cold seemed to belong to another world entirely. Here, in the warmth of the fire, the storm felt distant, as if it were something that could be shut out, something that had no power over what was happening inside. The rancher sat quietly by the hearth, the fire casting soft shadows over his weathered face. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this, a moment of peace, a moment of warmth. The light from the fire danced in his eyes, but it wasn't just the flames that were stirring something inside him. It was the presence of Emma and Rose, the quiet companionship they had brought into his life, something he hadn't known he longed for until now. Emma sat across from him, still awake, though her eyes were heavy with the weight of exhaustion. Rose had finally settled into a deep, peaceful sleep, her small form tucked beneath the quilt, her tiny breath steady and soft. The firelight flickered, casting a soft glow on Emma's tired face, but there was something different in her expression now, something that hadn't been there before. She seemed lighter, less burdened, as though the weight of the world had been lifted, even if only for a little while. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice quiet but sincere. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything unspoken, the gratitude, the relief, the understanding. She looked at him, her gaze steady, her hand resting gently on the edge of Rose's quilt. The rancher didn't know how to respond at first. He wasn't used to being thanked, not like this, not for something that had felt like the simplest decision he had made in years. "You don't need to thank me," he said gruffly, his voice rougher than he intended. "You're here now, and that's all that matters." Emma nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "You've been alone for a long time, haven't you?" she asked, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop it. The rancher's chest tightened, his throat closing up. He wasn't used to talking about the past, especially not with someone like Emma, someone who hadn't known him when he was still trying to make sense of the world. But her question lingered in the air, quiet and insistent, and for a moment he couldn't ignore it. "I've been alone long enough," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. His eyes didn't meet hers. Instead, he looked into the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, as though they might offer him some comfort. "Long enough to forget what it feels like to have someone around, to forget what it means to care." Emma didn't speak for a long time, and the rancher felt her gaze on him, but it wasn't judgmental, wasn't heavy with pity. It was understanding. It was empathy, something he hadn't experienced in years. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, a tender understanding in her words. "It's not too late to remember," she said quietly. "You don't have to carry all of this alone anymore." The rancher's eyes flickered to hers, and for a brief second he saw something in her gaze that made his chest tighten, something like hope, like a quiet invitation. He had spent so long closing himself off from the world, so long carrying the weight of his own guilt and grief, that he had forgotten what it meant to open up, to allow someone else in. But now, in the quiet of this storm-sheltered cabin, something inside him began to shift. "I don't know how to let go," he admitted, his voice rough and raw with emotion he hadn't realized was still there. Emma's gaze softened, her lips curving into a faint, understanding smile. "You don't have to do it all at once," she said. "Just take it one step at a time. You've already started. You're not alone anymore, not as long as we're here." The words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline. The rancher had lived his life thinking that survival was the only thing that mattered, that emotional distance was the only way to protect himself. But now, sitting across from Emma and Rose, he realized that survival wasn't enough. There had to be something more. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, stretching shadows across the cabin. The storm continued to roar outside, but inside there was a quiet stillness, a fragile peace that felt like it might hold. Emma and Rose had brought something with them, something that had made him realize that even in the harshest of circumstances, there was room for more than just survival. There was room for connection, for healing, for love, even if it was just a small, quiet seed that needed time to grow. As he looked at Emma, his gaze softened, and he felt a small, unexpected surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to rebuild what had been lost. The storm outside still howled, but the rancher didn't mind. The storm would pass. He had seen enough storms in his life to know that they never lasted forever. And when this one finally ended, perhaps the rancher would find that the world outside had changed. Perhaps for the first time in a long while he could step into the light again, not as someone broken, but as someone willing to heal. And as the fire burned low and the wind howled like a faraway memory, the rancher felt something shift within him, something that had been buried deep for far too long. Something that could finally begin to heal. The storm would pass, but for now there was peace, there was warmth, and for the first time in years the rancher felt the stirrings of a new beginning.